Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into this episode. Please stay tuned after the episode to find out how you can get two awesome recipes, the brownie recipe from All Stirred Up and Thomas Jefferson's ice cream recipe from the Hamilton Cookbook. Enjoy the show. Hello everybody and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I have a very, very special episode for you today. Today's episode is about suffrage. And you might wonder, well, what does that have to do with food? And we are going to talk all about that today. My guest today is Laura Cuming. She is a food writer who has written two books that combine food and history. Her latest book, All Stirred Up, Suffrage Cookbooks, Food, and the Battle for Women's Right to Vote, includes recipes from the Suffrage Cookbooks in their original form and also adapted for the modern cook. Welcome to the show, Laura.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am so excited. So for people who are regular listeners, they will remember your name because I had you on the podcast a couple of years ago to discuss your first cookbook, the Hamilton Cookbook. And the story of that goes that my mother had gotten me that cookbook for Christmas. And I didn't even know that it existed. I'm a huge Hamilton fan and I was so excited. And so then I got to thinking, well, this author, this Laura Cuming is really interesting. I'd love to talk with her and have her on the podcast. So I stalked you on Twitter and asked you to be on the show. And we had a lovely conversation. That was episode 90. And now I'm in the 160s, if you can believe it.
Wow.
But not only did we have a lovely conversation on that podcast, I was then visiting Washington, D.C., where you live, for my National Dietitian Conference. And my son and my husband were with me. We were doing some sightseeing. So you and I met up with my husband and my son for lunch. And then just this last February, I took my mother to D.C. to see a really good family friend of ours perform in a Shakespeare play at the Folgers Theater. And we met up with you for breakfast and also a mutual friend that you introduced me to through Twitter, Stacy Vieira. Shout out to her. And you said to me and my mom that we had to go see the suffrage exhibit because it's the 100-year anniversary. And that's when I found out the exciting news about your new book. So it's kind of a long intro, but that is the history. We have become friends. And I was so excited to hear about this book. I was fortunate enough to get a preview copy. And I got to tell you, I've been burning the midnight oil. This book is fascinating. Oh. So I've just shared all this information. I'm so excited to have you on the show. I would love for you to share with our listeners who did not hear the Hamilton Cookbook episode a little bit about your interesting background.
Well, I say that I'm a recovering lawyer, although now I think I'm fully recovered. I began food blogging when I thought that my kids, who really didn't know how to cook, went off to college, and I thought, oh, I should really have taught them how to cook. And so I started to write a book. And then I realized that kids their age don't read cookbooks. They look online. So I created my Mother Would Know food blog. And from there, someone asked me to write the Hamilton Cookbook, and I did. Then there was this one, and that's where it is.
Well, and I remember when we talked about the Hamilton Cookbook, you really enjoyed the research process and the Library of Congress, right?
Right.
Yes. I was just thinking of you just enjoying that research process for this book as well. But we have so much to talk about with this book. It's an election year. Getting this episode out before Election Day, it's very important to know the history. One of the things that you often say, and I've got all these reviews on the book and everything, is that, you know, when we hear about the suffrage movement, or we read about it, in books, history books, see it on TV. We usually hear about these loud militant women. But you've done some research to kind of share the other side of the story that involves food and cookbooks. So let's start with, what is suffrage? And you've got a wonderful, this book is really just as much a history book as it is a cookbook. And I found it fascinating. But just for those who may not be familiar with the term, what is suffrage? And then we'll dive into the book.
Well, suffrage really means the right to vote. It doesn't mean the right to vote by any specific person or group, but women's suffrage is, of course, what we're talking about now. But, there are plenty of other ways in which suffrage has come up in history. Plenty of other groups who have been denied the right to vote and then won their right in some way.
Okay. And as I said, it is the 100-year anniversary. But to be specific, August 2020 marked the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the right to vote. And actually, it's really prohibiting the government from denying the right to vote. And this did not happen overnight. And that's a big part of, I think, what led to this history and the involvement of the cookbook. One of the things you do in this book that you did in the Hamilton Cookbook, which I absolutely love, is you have this timeline. You've got a timeline with what was going on with suffrage milestones, but also just what was happening in the United States and around the world at the time, and also what was happening in the food world. Or with regard to, agriculture or food safety or innovations and developments. So I love that. And you have recipes, which we're going to talk about. But what was the deciding factor? What made you decide to write this book in the first place?
Well, I came upon one of the suffrage cookbooks. And once I found one, I really wanted to know how many there were and what the story was behind them. And in fact, it turned out that it took me literally years to chase them all down, but I have now seen all but one of the existing suffrage cookbooks. And there are only 7 or possibly 8, depending on how you count them, of these books in existence today, or at least that we know of. There may be ones that are hidden in somebody's attic or, that are in some state historical society that nobody knows about. But it's really an amazing story. And as I uncovered these individual cookbooks, I also uncovered some evidence that, in fact, there were others. And so one of my goals, I would say, or something that would make me just joyful would be if I could ever find one of the ones that's been lost, but that I know in fact existed at one point.
Right. So how many did you say?
Well, there are only 7 or possibly 8, depending on how you count them, suffrage cookbooks that we know of today that we can find. And 2 of these cookbooks are too delicate to even be scanned. So one of them, I managed to get a copy that had been scanned about a decade ago. And so I've seen that one. But the last one is a very small cookbook that's in a state historical society in Clinton, New York. And I have not yet gotten to see it because you have to go in person to the Clinton Historical Society. Mm-hmm. And I just haven't been able to do that.
Oh, someday you'll have to make a point to do that.
I was planning on it, believe me.
Before the pandemic?
Yeah.
That's interesting too, because who thought my last trip of 2020 would have been visiting Washington, D.C. in late February?
Yeah.
I had a lot of other plans as well, as we all did. So then I guess the next question is, how many do we think that there were at one time?
We have no idea. I know of at least one other that seems to have existed, but I think there were probably more. Mm-hmm. They were community cookbooks. They were created by the women who lived in a particular area for a particular purpose, but there could have been lots of others.
So let's talk about this, because these aren't just cookbooks from that time. There was a purpose, a very specific purpose for these cookbooks. So I'm going to tease that a little bit, because I do want to talk a little bit about the suffrage movement in and of itself before we talk about, the role of the cookbook. But as I said, this didn't happen overnight. The timeline that you share in the book starts way back in 1848 and goes up to 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified.
I would add that for me as a lawyer, 1920 wasn't even the end, because there were in fact challenges to the 19th Amendment, and they didn't end until 1922. So it was fully 2 years after that ratification process ended that really the questions about whether the 19th Amendment would in fact give women the right to vote, those questions were put to bed.
Right.
At least for some women.
Well, exactly. And that's what it's important for us to know the history. And there's so much that led up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And yet, even after that, there were still obstacles and barriers to voting. And even to this day, there's still some issues in that arena. And then we just had the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This is an important time in history. And one of the reasons I want to get this episode out before Election Day is to encourage everybody to use their voice and their vote. So let's talk about the history of the suffrage movement, where the cookbook comes into play. So why cookbooks and how were they used?
Well, in the beginning, of course, there were not cookbooks. I mean, there wasn't even, suffrage as the big issue for women, because when you think about it, the women of the 1840s and 1850s really had so few rights, and there were so many obstacles in their paths that voting wasn't necessarily the obvious choice for an issue. But once it did become the issue, it became the issue that would lead to other rights being given and other rights being taken. The Civil War was, in fact, the time when community cookbooks came into being. And the suffrage cookbooks are really a type of community cookbook. In the beginning, they were fundraisers. And they were not just fundraisers, but they were kind of a way to begin conversation about suffrage, about the issues. And it was only after the Civil War. I mean, the beginning of the suffrage movement was in the 1840s. Well, then came the Civil War. And only after the Civil War, it's only in the 1880s that you get the first suffrage cookbook. And this is a 70-plus year battle of which, you see suffrage cookbooks beginning in the 1880s, and then they continue right on through almost till the very end.
How did race and possibly religion factor into the suffrage movement?
Well, unfortunately, at the time, the period after the Civil War, there was Reconstruction, which was a time when it was thought that, finally people who were not white would be given the rights that they were entitled to. But there was backsliding, and the society was really very racist. And the suffrage movement, unfortunately, reflected the greater societal racism. And so what you'll see in the suffrage movement, if you look at the history, is that there were many suffragists of color. There were suffragists who were African American. There were suffragists who were Asian American. But they were not allowed to be leaders in the suffrage movement, and often they were not even allowed to participate in suffrage activities. And what they did, which was admirable and really kind of unbelievable, was that they continued to fight for suffrage in their own way and in their own groups, because they weren't allowed to be part of the larger movement. There were instances in which, in fact, one of the leaders of the suffrage movement specifically asked Frederick Douglass, who was a great believer in suffrage, not to come to suffrage meetings that were held in the South.
Wow.
And he did not attend those meetings. So that's just one instance. Of course, there are many, many others. And there were many women who are now being celebrated as suffragists, not just as African American suffragists, but really as suffragists, who at the time were not treated well by the white leadership and even by the white suffrage movement in general.
Yeah, I read in the book how they would invite people of color and then sort of uninvite them, kind of bowing to pressure in some instances.
That's right. And there's actually a very famous story of a suffragist named Ida Wells. And she was African American, and she was not allowed to walk in a large suffrage march with the Illinois delegation, of which she was a part. Well, she stepped out, but when the Illinois delegation came around, she joined her fellow delegates, and she marched with them despite the ruling of the suffrage leadership, which was that she should not participate with her state delegation and instead should march at the back.
I love that story. So where do men, and maybe even some famous men, fit into the suffrage story?
Well, there were a number of famous men who were suffrage, what we would call these days, allies. In those days, there was actually a suffragist who coined the term suffragents. And so these men were suffragents. And there was a group of very rich and powerful, many were rich, and they were certainly powerful and well-known men who were in favor of suffrage in New York, who created an organization that they used they became actually people who would lobby other rich and powerful men to join the cause. And these were men who had access to places in society that women just didn't have access to at that point. There were also famous suffragist men who were, for example, the author Jack London, who's quite a, Call of the Wild, White Fang. He was quite a debonair man, and he was a suffragist. There was Mark Twain actually became a supporter of suffrage.
So who were the aunties, and what were their concerns or fears about women voting?
Well, the aunties were very interesting. And to me, this was one of the great revelations. I had expected to find that the aunties would be people I disliked and that they would be mostly men. Well, in fact, it turns out that they were not mostly men, that in the beginning there were many women who were aunties being the short form of anti-suffragists. And those aunties, many of the women of the well-known aunties, were not only quite accomplished, but they actually did things that you would actually think that they were supporters of women's rights in many ways. There was one woman, Josephine Jewell Dodge, who was the founder of several daycare centers for the working women and their children. And she was the founder of organizations that were about taking care of the children of working women. Well, that doesn't sound like somebody who's opposed to women's rights. Another of the aunties was a woman named Annie Nathan Meyer. I always get them confused. She was actually one of the founders of Barnard College. And she had gone to Columbia and quit when she found that they really weren't taking her seriously as a woman student. And when she founded Barnard, she broke the color barrier and actually supported a very famous African-American woman author, Zora Neale Hurston, as a student. She paid Zora Neale Hurston's tuition at Barnard.
Wow.
Does that sound like somebody who isn't a proponent of women's rights? These women, for whatever reason, they thought that it was unnecessary for women to vote and that it would actually be harmful to women. Later there were other forces that opposed suffrage, but in the beginning, these women were really part of the early anti-group.
Yeah, they thought it would set women back somehow, and that this division of, the men's world and the women's world, there was some kind of power in keeping those separate in some way.
Yeah, it's a mystery to me. Still is.
Yeah. So let's talk again about the origins of the cookbook. Was this idea born, or did it just sort of happen and take off?
Well, we don't really know how the first suffrage cookbook came to be, other than that it was an attempt to raise money and to raise consciousness. And it was also, in a third way, it was a way to fight against the idea that the suffragists were anti-home and hearth and family. Mm. You know, it was really taking what they already knew. These women knew how to cook. And whether they were cooking because they had to or cooking because they liked to, cooking was a big part of their lives. They didn't have convenience foods in 1886.
Right, right. Well, and it reminds me of a saying or a quote that you have about food. So I'd like you to share that with us because it sounds like your philosophy, your food philosophy, is the perfect fit for this cookbook.
Well, I think the quote that you're probably referring to is the tagline for my author site, which is that food is common ground. You know, everybody has to eat, whether you are the person making the food, eating the food, both. You know, everybody has to, at some point, eat and hopefully enjoy their food.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, that's the quote. When you talk about food is common ground and you say that, you know, when people cook and eat together, they learn to understand each other. And that's what I've been hearing with the Suffrage Cookbooks, is that it was a way to get a conversation started and to open hearts and minds a little bit, if you will. I believe you had also said this as well, is that it was a way to talk with other women in a non-threatening way and just sort of build those relationships and get into that conversation about women's right to vote.
Well, many of the women who participated in creating the cookbooks or in selling them, they would take them and use them as they would have one under their arm and go and canvass. So they'd go and knock on a door and talk to the women of the family. And they wouldn't begin by talking about suffrage. They'd begin by talking about recipes and food and things that they all had in common. And before you know it, they could turn the conversation.
Very, very smart and savvy. Well, you also talk in the book, before we start talking about the recipes and what that was like, there was this parallel here with this cookbook and the Hamilton Cookbook with the old way the recipes were written, and, you know, you had to kind of make sense of what that was. But before we get into that, I wanted to read something from the book because it talks about the domestic science, which you say later was termed home economics. So this domestic science movement gave women an entree into previously male-centered fields, such as chemistry, while the household remained a separate, uniquely female sphere. What was domestic science and how did it translate to cooking? One of the early proponents of domestic science answered it this way. Many of our people have awakened to the fact that eating is something more than animal indulgence and that cooking has a nobler purpose than the gratification of appetite and the sense of taste. Cooking has been defined as the art of preparing food for the nourishment of the human body. I just thought that was so apropos for my field. And actually, I think it even says something about, yes, it says, let me read a little bit more. Emphasizing the scientific value of food, good nutrition, as they understood it, and the process of digestion, domestic science, often called scientific cookery, which cracks me up, when referring to food, put health at the top of its priority list. Although many of the ideas espoused in the name of healthy eating would puzzle or disturb a modern nutritionist, the concern for well-balanced meals and good health remains. I just thought that was really interesting from a nutrition home ec standpoint. Scientific cookery. So let's talk a little bit about the scientific cookery, the recipes. And I also have a few questions for you with regard to sort of what you noticed in your research about nutrition and health, or, you know, food in that sense. So with regard to the recipes, you have these ancient recipes. You did what you did with the Hamilton Cookbook as well, and you adapted them so that the modern cook could actually prepare them. So talk to me about some of the recipes that are in the book that you adapted and really what that whole process was like to make the adaptations and what went into that.
The first thing that went into it was that I'd look at the way they prepared food and I'd see if there were things that were missing from the explanations because, you know, in the days of these suffrage cookbooks, women basically knew what temperature, what the timing should be for lots of different kinds of dishes that today in a cookbook you would naturally expect to see, what's the oven temperature? How long do you leave it in? But in their minds, you could just say, put it in a low oven and cook it till it's done. We can't follow that recipe.
That would not work for me.
But the other thing I did really look at was that some of their ideas, for example, how long they cooked vegetables. I mean, you and your nutritionist colleagues would be appalled at the amount of time that they said you should leave a string bean or a piece of broccoli to cook us in asparagus. I mean, an hour? Really?
My goodness.
And so, I looked at both whether the directions were complete, but also whether we have come to a different understanding of how to cook certain foods. And there are ways in which I looked at a recipe and I said, whoa, there are a couple of recipes I included that I said, I just have to include this, even though I can't imagine that anybody really thinks these are Mexican noodles. There was nothing Mexican about the noodles. The other thing is that in those days, meaning the period of suffrage, when their ideas about health were very different from ours, they would give people raw meat when they were sick. I mean, can you imagine?
No.
Steak tartare is something that I haven't had in decades.
Right.
Much less I wouldn't feed it to somebody who had an ailment.
Right. And the measurements too. I remember what it was like, a bunch of asparagus or celery or something. It was like, well, how much is a bunch?
Right. Also they were cooking to put things away, and they were cooking for much bigger families and for large quantities. I mean, I have a recipe that I think I cut it in thirds. It was ketchup. I mean, it still made an enormous quantity of this condiment.
A bucket of ketchup.
Goodness. Who needs a bucket of ketchup?
Oh, that's funny. Well, and is there something about white foods? Because you had mentioned that when you encouraged my mom and I to go see the suffrage exhibit, and I've been waiting since February to find out what was the symbolism maybe of the white foods.
What was the deal with white foods, right? Well, they had some very odd ideas about what was appropriate and what was good. And for example, they thought that it was a very good thing to cover everything in sauce. So a lot of white sauces. So things would get covered. You could have a food that wasn't white, but you would cover it in a white sauce. And that was somehow made it better. Well, most of us don't, A, we don't eat a lot of sauces, and B, we certainly wouldn't want things to be covered that might taste good underneath. But, these were their views. They had views about what was healthful. White food was considered good.
It's interesting because these days eat the rainbow and all the colors in the fruits and vegetables provide important, antioxidants and plant nutrition. And yet the white foods are, your carbs and, all these foods that lack color are kind of thrown under the bus as not as nutritious. But of course, onions and mushrooms and garlic and even carbohydrates that are white still provide nutrition, but it's another story.
White potatoes, white bread, white rice, those were very acceptable. And even, they were the foods that they thought were really staples, whereas we are into brown rice, whole grain breads,
Mm-hmm.
Sweet potatoes.
Yes. Although I have a great podcast interview with Dr. Julie Miller-Jones on all things carbs. It's my most popular episode. I don't remember the number, but I'll put it in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com if anybody wants to check that out. Talking about it's not just the whole grains. It's all carbohydrates that actually provide some good nutrition. So I also wanted to ask you what some of your favorite recipes are in the book. And one that jumped out at me was this carrot salad. It looks really easy and tasty, but I wanted you to tell us what an emergency salad is, because there's an emergency salad in the book. And I thought, is that like companies coming, got to throw something together? What's an emergency salad?
It is, in fact, I believe it's companies coming, but it was a very popular salad of the time. And one of the ways that I researched how to make things in the book that really were unknown to me was that I have a very old copy of the Fannie Farmer cookbook and a very old copy of another cookbook, which is well known in the Jewish community, called the Settlement Cookbook. And I would look at those, and they often had the same recipes or similar recipes to what were in the suffrage cookbooks. And emergency salad is...
It's a thing.
It's a thing. And as they say, although I have to admit that in my adaptation, I was really giving a nod in a quiet way to Ina Garten, because what I did was, instead of, they say, use any salad dressing. And I said, well, you should actually use lime juice and olive oil. And if you know the Ina Garten recipe it's a watermelon salad with raw onion. The emergency salad is apple and raw onion. And I think raw onion is way too strong. But Ina Garten in the watermelon salad sort of soaks it a little bit in lime juice, and that kind of cuts the sharpness. And in fact, that's what I suggest in the adaptation, that if you use lime juice, it kind of cuts that. You use a very little bit of raw onion, and you cut the sharpness with the lime juice.
It sounds delicious.
So it's actually kind of good.
Yeah. So what were some of your favorite recipes in there?
Well, I'm kind of a sweetaholic, so I have to admit that I love the brownie recipe, which is also a favorite of mine, because brownies were not invented until the very end of the 19th century, sort of the very late 1800s. And they didn't find their way into a cookbook, which was in fact the Boston Cookbook, what we've come to know as Fannie Farmer, until the very beginning of the 20th century. And by 1909, they're already popular in Washington state and included by one of the women in the Washington Women's Cookbook, which is one of the suffrage cookbooks. And so I thought that was kind of neat in the days before social media and, there was no Twitter and Instagram, but, the news of this chocolate treat obviously it went very quickly.
Went viral.
Viral from one coast to the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a very good old-fashioned recipe for brownies. It's not, the modern, so big that you can barely fit it in your mouth kind. It's a very, small but very rich brownie.
Well, I will have to try that. My regular listeners know that I love a good brownie, and I'm always looking for one that's healthy enough to have for breakfast. But brownie's a brownie, right? Well, good. What other recipes? I know that the book is broken down into 3 parts, and it goes along with, like, you start, you've got the history and the timeline and the information, but part 1, those recipes are like appetizers. And then in part 3, you've got like the desserts. So it kind of follows along with soup to nuts, if you will. So what are some of your other favorite recipes in the book?
Well, there are some very sort of standard things. There's a very standard kind of beef stew, but in those days it was called hodgepodge. And I kind of like that. There's a very unusual gingerbread recipe in the book, which is one made with sour cream. And it's very simple and it's quite delicious.
I bet that adds a lot of creaminess and moisture.
It's very, very moist.
Very good. Well, in doing your research and making all these modifications to these recipes, what would you say was the most interesting or surprising thing that you learned?
Well, I think the most surprising thing to me was learning about the women who were the aunties, because, really I had a very mistaken impression. The other thing that I guess I found fascinating was that, I had the same impression that many people have, which is that the suffrage movement was about the women who were picketing and the ones who kind of were in all the big marches. And what I learned from doing this research was that there were really hundreds of thousands of women, maybe even millions, who were blanketing the country. And I mean, literally, they went everywhere. And they went to small towns, they went to rural areas, and they were very, very savvy marketers. There's a story in the book about something that's just called the Suffrage Pig. I think that I really had not understood how incredibly smart these women were in terms of their political savvy. Because if you think about it, to get suffrage, they had to convince men to vote for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was not enough to convince other women because the voters, the people who would pass the 19th Amendment, and in fact, for many years, there was a move to create state-by-state change. So, you know, whether it was in a state or in Congress, there were men voting. And the ratification story is a story of convincing men to vote. And, you know, these women were very smart about how they went about that. Mm-hmm. And there were women who were radical and loud, kind of what we would call the nasty women. But there were also a lot of women who wore fur coats and were very quiet and dignified about how they supported suffrage. Mm-hmm. And suffrage was really about all of those women.
Right. And that's why it's just so wonderful to learn more about the history, because as you say, there were the sort of, you know, the icons that we see and hear about as far as, you know, the loud, strong marchers and, you know, speakers, leaders. But then there were all sorts of women behind the scenes with this cookbook, and through all different efforts, this came about.
Well, and some of those efforts were food related in ways that really surprised me. I had no idea that there were suffrage lunchrooms, and they weren't just in New York. They were in many, many places in the country. And these lunchrooms would provide meals at a very good, reasonable cost. The food was good, and men would go. And, you know, when they would go to these lunchrooms, they would look down and they would see a napkin that said votes for women. Well, you know, I mean, there were examples of women who they did suffrage baseball games in which a group of women would play baseball and would go around the country playing other teams of men. There were women who were selling tickets to what were very popular baseball games between the teams that we know. But with a ticket, you would get a piece of cake and you would get a suffrage, you know, it was a sort of a suffrage moment, you know, it was a suffrage free ticket, you know. So there were lots of ways in which the suffrage movement found ways to get to men, particularly, who really weren't all that interested in the suffrage story. But, you know, they wouldn't mind a piece of cake. They wouldn't mind a ticket to a baseball game. And next thing you know, oh, okay, suffrage seems like not a bad idea.
Yes, some savvy marketing, some savvy communications for sure. So how does the history of suffrage and women's right to vote impact women today above and beyond having that right to vote, especially in this election year? And I know there's also a quote that you have from Ruth Bader Ginsburg I'd love you to share.
Well, you know, I think one of the ways in which suffrage really changed how women could function in this society is that if you look at where women are today, women are everywhere in politics. There are women at every level of government. There are women in every branch of the government. And all of that started with suffrage. And that is, in fact, what Thomas Cahill, he's written many books, and he's really a very thoughtful historian. He calls a hinge in history, where something opens the door to bigger changes and to different changes. And, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was once asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And she said, well, if there are 9 women, that would be fine. I can't remember the exact quote, but the idea was that for many years there were 9 men. Well, she didn't think it was a bad idea if there would be 9 women,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to share this quote, which I actually found on Twitter from Alexander Vindman, who said that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quote was, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you."
Mm.
And to me, that's what the suffragists who created the suffrage cookbooks and the food-related marketing of suffrage were all about. They were looking for finding ways to lead other people to join them in the fight for suffrage.
Wonderful words. And just so thankful that you did the research and you wrote this book and that I've been able to connect with you on this and have you on the show. The call to action, of course, is, women, get out there. Your vote counts. Please use it. And also, this book would be a wonderful gift for any woman in your life or a man. It's just truly a great exploration of the history, and the connection to food is just wonderful. So thank you so much, Laura.
Well, thank you. And I hope your listeners will all know that the way to really celebrate suffrage is to vote.
Absolutely. Amen. Thank you for sharing that.
So thank you so much, Melissa, for having me.
I look forward to staying connected with you, and maybe there's another book on the horizon for you.
Well, I hope so. And I can only tell you that I look forward to breaking bread with you again very soon.
I would love that. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and get out and vote. Till next time. Okay, everybody, here's how you can get those 2 awesome recipes I mentioned at the beginning. The brownies from All Stirred Up and Thomas Jefferson's ice cream recipe from the Hamilton Cookbook. Simply go to Laura's author site at lauracumin.com and sign up for her newsletter for this sign-up bonus. On that site, you'll also see info on how you can order Laura's books, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bookshop.org. You can also check out Laura's blog at motherwouldknow.com for more recipes, her kernels of wisdom on cooking, and more. And also be sure to follow Laura on social media. She's on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. All of those links are on her site and in my show notes as well at soundbitesrd.com/161. And finally, please make sure you vote on or before Election Day. So many people fought for your right to vote. Please use your voice and vote. Take care.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.